welcome to our initiative China After COVID-19, Economic Revival and Challenges to the World. I am Giulia Sciorati, I am China Desk at the ISPI Asia Center. This is the first of two sessions. The next will be held on next Tuesday, the 23rd, and will be moderated by our own Alessia Mighini, so do not miss out. Before starting this event and this discussion and welcoming the speakers, I would like to thank the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, whose support made this initiative and the related study possible. I also would like to thank you all for tuning in today with us. This afternoon, we will discuss China's post-lockdown economic landscape by focusing on three broad topics. The first, the effect of the pandemic on China's economy and economic sectors. The second, the response of the Chinese government to the economic and health crisis. And third, the impact of digital technologies during and after the national acute health crisis. Before introducing our distinguished panelists, let me remind you to ask as many questions as possible via the chat box throughout all the discussion. I will then direct them to the speakers, so if you have a particular speaker in mind, please, make sure not to forget to indicate the name of the speaker to whom you are posing your question. I'm now very happy to welcome our speakers today. The first being Haihong Gao, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, professor. The second, Elisa Sales, Bank of Italy representative at the Embassy of Italy in China. And last but not least, Maximilian Karnfeld, analyst at the Mercator Institute of China Studies in Berlin. Thank you all for being here. Max, I would like to start the discussion today with you, and I would like to ask whether you could tell us something about how, in your opinion, the pandemic has been affecting both the Chinese government, the Chinese economy, and government responses. You have 5 to 7 minutes to give us an answer to this very broad question. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello to everyone watching around the world. Let me first start by saying thank you to ISPI for organizing this event and to my co-panelists for participating. Well, what I would like to start with is characterizing the Chinese government response to the COVID pandemic, which began in Wuhan. So the way it looked to me was that the Chinese government wanted to largely contain the pandemic to Wuhan, and so they locked the city down. And then when they found out that COVID had spread to the rest of the world, they also enforced strong restrictions on China's external borders and began looking for cases outside of Wuhan to get those under control. The lockdown measures in most of China were very harsh, but effective, as we see at least from the official government statistics. Death numbers in China have been per capita much lower than Western countries. So I think we can characterize the Chinese response as effective, although very, very brutal in cases. I mean, there's even videos of people being locked into their apartments with chain locks on the outside, people being forcibly subjected to COVID tests and such things. But I think still the numbers do speak for themselves, and that's something we should note. As has been the case in Western countries, the lockdown itself was probably more damaging to the economy than people being sick, and this was the case in China too. Chinese real economic growth fell to, I believe, now I don't remember the exact figure, but it fell to, I think, -6% or something like that, and which is the biggest drop in GDP in Chinese history. Now, the contraction happened across almost every sector imaginable, everything from investments, construction, retail consumption, And even unemployment increased, which is not so common in countries with the degree of state involvement in the economy as China has. So a very strong effect across the whole of the Chinese economy. And it might be the case that official statistics even understate this. And I think we can look at two data points that may support this. The first one is electricity consumption in China, which fell by about 10%, which is more than real GDP fell by, perhaps indicating a greater contraction than the official numbers capture. The second is if we look at emissions of CO2 emissions and other pollutants. If you look at satellite images of China during this period and compare them to the year before, there's an almost complete reduction of all emissions, which would be impossible unless industrial production had almost ceased. Nevertheless, there was a great contraction. The Chinese government decided to step in with all kinds of stimulus measures to support the economy. They used both fiscal measures, such as supplying companies with emergency credit, lowering VAT, state investment in various projects, and then on the monetary side, interest rates were lowered, banks' reserve requirements were lowered, and monetary injections were at an absolutely enormous scale. This engineered a very sharp recovery, again, across all sectors, and a recovery that was stronger than the rest of the world. When most of the OECD has had 2 consecutive quarters of contracting economic growth, which is the definition for recession. China escaped this fate. But what's to be noted here is that recovery in China was the strongest when in investments and exports, whilst domestic consumption was lagging behind very strongly. At the same time, you see almost the opposite situation abroad, where domestic consumption has managed to remain relatively strong even in the pandemic. So in a sense, the rest of the world was absorbing Chinese surpluses, and the Chinese government engineered domestic demand that could absorb the domestic production and make sure that growth, that the Chinese GDP grew by, even though we were in a crisis year. So we have a economic result of growing by 2.3% in 2020, which is almost astonishing, but given that the whole of the world has been in lockdown for a whole year and China was in lockdown for an entire month. So there is something slightly artificial about the recovery, but it's still a stronger result than the rest of the world has had.
Thank you very much.
And I think I would like to pick up on more in the later segment.
Well, thank you very much, Max, and thank you for the quite broad overview of what happened in China during the acute phase of the pandemic. I think that one of the elements that actually the past year has made very clear, and I'd like to talk a bit about this in the next few minutes, is that the fact that past experiences confronting natural and man-made disasters has in a sense proven to be an advantage to China but other Asian economies' recoveries. So, Professor Gao, I wanted to ask you, would you say that this really is the case for China, and can you maybe help us understand in a little more detail whether responses against SARS in 2003, for instance, can be compared to the current strategies that the Chinese government adopted?
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much for having me here. Yes, indeed, the experience of SARS crisis during 2002 and 2003 has certainly provided valuable experience for the government as well as the society in handling the pandemic this time.
Please, so you were saying that...
Where should I start? I'm sorry, because I didn't realize where
perfectly fine.
was
Just
interrupted.
well, your points. You can just start over so that the public can really follow your train of thoughts. Thank you very much, and apologies.
Okay, right. I mean, so the monetary policy. Let me come to this. Policy actions. The monetary policy is very loose, but it's also, we call it, very targeted to small and medium enterprises. And actually, there is a principle of this, with no flood-like stimulus. It's a guidance of this policy framework throughout the period. And the PBC actually use the targeted tools and the structured tools for it's like more targeted to vulnerable sectors. Fiscal policy, of course, is loose as well, but it's very well measured, and it's another stimulus launched last May, but it's completely different target. We call it new target. So this is something the policymakers learned lessons from the past experience, especially the global financial crisis, the aftermath of this, the fallout of stimulus, and now is more cautious and fully aware of the risks. Last year we see some potential default, and the Vice Premier Liu He warned the government should show zero tolerance for misconduct. This shows that the government actually very, is concerned about rising risks in financial system. So I'll stop there. There are many more policy actions in details that I look forward to more details that discuss later.
Thank you very much, Professor, and apologies again for the technical difficulties. Before passing over to our next speaker, I wanted to ask Max, I would like your opinion on what actually has been said so far, and especially whether you agree or not, or to what extent you think that these past experiences and all the responses that the Chinese government have put in place in an effort to really push the economic relaunch and response. I was asking Max what he thinks about this second point of our discussion, whether these past experiences actually had this strong of an impact towards the responses that China has enacted. Max, let's try to get back to you, and let's hope we can hear you.
Yes. I think it would be very surprising if past experiences had not helped China. The situation with SARS was obviously a learning moment, Professor Gao also brought up the global financial crisis as a moment where government support was used to drive the economy out of a difficult situation. She characterized it as that the current stimulus efforts are smaller than they were back then. But I would like to point out that there was definitely not as much room for stimulus this time around. The Chinese government revenues are at a weaker state. The official deficit is higher. Overall leverage in the banking system is much higher than back then. Now, she also said that, in using the words of the Chinese central bank governor, that the current stimulus is targeted and not a flood. But I think what happens here linguistically is that we're saying that everything that is not on the level of the global financial crisis stimulus can't be called a flood. I mean, in this case, the Chinese credit to GDP ratio increased by 35 percentage points in the course of half a year or so. The amount of monetary injections that were unleashed in the first half of 2020 were as great as the entirety of 2019. Basically, every metric of stimulus you can think of was used. Now, I'm not saying that this is a particularly bad thing, because it was a crisis. And she also mentioned some defaults, and there are several Chinese companies which are now in a state of experiencing financial difficulties. The most prominent of these would be Evergrande and H&A, which are both having difficulties paying back their loans. And recent reports from Fitch suggests that a very large share of companies issuing bonds in China are not particularly creditworthy.
Thank you very much for, giving your opinion on this. And I'm very excited to introduce our third speaker, and especially the third topic that she presents us. This third topic has been very debated throughout the health crisis, even in Italy, and that is the role of digital technologies. Which role digital technologies have been playing during the acute phase of the health crisis and even beyond for the relaunch. Elisa, do you care to tell us something about it? I know you're an expert on this, and I'm really looking forward to your talk and your opinion and your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. In China, during and after crisis, new technologies have played a real role in several areas. They're ranging from the control of the virus to the health system, to the daily life activities, and to the economic recovery. China's economic and social revival after the outbreak has been fostered by the broad application of digitalization and the use of technology. The sector of information technology, software, and the overall information services the highest rate of growth in 2020. It was about 17%. Even if it still represents a component of the overall GDP, it is still less. Regarding the use of thinking about the effective and effective measures taken with general purposive not to suppress the virus. Max already described finally this topic. These measures were complemented and supported by innovative technologies, becoming a part of the Chinese consolidated surveillance system. A capillary and intrusive contacting model has been adopted, leveraging on technology as biometrics and geolocalization, track and flatline the spread of the virus. These digital technologies, through the necessary involvement of telecommunication tech companies, provide relevant data on people movement in the Please, Julia is online?
Yes.
The streaming is working?
Yes, the streaming is working. We have some difficulties hearing you, but well, I think that let's try and see if we can hear you better.
Okay. The one example is the mobile health advice, the so-called health code. It was adopted locally in the first phase only at the beginning of 2021, perhaps level to manage the expected for the Chinese New Year. The result is a centralization of the data. The health code, even if not compulsory, is required to all close the area, from underground to malls, to the shops, restaurants, and also the engines. In large cities such as Beijing, from several essential services if they do not have the health code. Technologies have been widely adopted to track individuals and to prevent the COVID spread, as they have already in several areas, including the big cities and also rural provinces, especially those with the large minorities. They were also combined with tools. I'm thinking about the imaging enhanced artificial intelligence that allow to monitor status during the pandemic and also to identify people. It was quite. These instruments are helpful in the tracking and social control, especially if they are compared with the light approach of countries due to political decisions in other countries, as also to the direction of data and privacy framework. The international travel health certificate was launched. It was news of a few days ago. It is managed by Tencent through encrypted QR code, and it is available only authorities to verify the holder's personal information as the vaccine inoculation, the nucleic acid test, and the results. Starting with the COVID outbreak, innovative approaches and services have been introduced also in the health sector that was largely impacted by the virus. It was hinging on technologies too. The healthcare is moving forward to a digital health, leveraging on new tools, and in the meantime, leveraging all expertise, revising and re-engineering processes and also healthcare approaches. Online services have recorded a rapid development in China, with a large increase and an extensive range of services. The trend has been exacerbated by the shortage of medical resources, which had to be mainly concentrated, and especially in the first phases, on contrasting the pandemic. The new technologies allow to provide some healthcare services to more people at a lower cost and requiring less human resources, partially offsetting the wide gaps in the Chinese healthcare system. In hospital, during the pandemic, 500 robots have used resources in common and easy tasks, redesigning processes and roles, and also reducing the cross-infection risk due to the virus. And medical evolved in the so-called internet hospitals, have gained interest in China and at global level. I'm thinking to big players like WeDoctor, Alibaba Health, and Ping An Doctor. So other players as a Young Hospital or the Washan Hospital managed by the Fudan University. An internet hospital can be defined as a platform that allows to deliver health services from consultation and prescriptions, treatment. These services are provided through internet technologies. After the COVID outbreak, the central government has issued policies to favor internet hospital addressing public health emergencies. The online medical services in China separated into the health services and insurance. Chinese hospitals are now beginning to publish their own internet-based services. They allow to minimize contacts on one terms, to costs, to expand and improve the services distribution, narrow the gap between the rural and the urban in the healthcare system in China. They provide prompt telemedicine, multidisciplinary and enhancing the efficiency of the treatment through technologies. After the COVID, this crisis, they could continue to help, also in the normal situation, and improve the healthcare, partially offsetting its weaknesses as overall the world. In the medium and the long term, the pandemic and so work also in the health system has catalyzed for the development of the domestic and the global health system, fostering by the adoption of technologies, even if more resources, human, not only technology, also financial, are needed. The Chinese government is committed to promote a rapid growth of the Internet Plus healthcare initiatives. It is a project. It was started, but it was fostered in this phase. It was just recently in the Lianhui. This is the main point on my side from the adoption of technologies and also after the crisis in China.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for this broader review. As we're with you, we started to discuss, well, the post-COVID phase of China's relaunch. And I wanted to ask a very, concrete question to Professor Gao. Professor Gao, in your opinion, which should be the steps that the Chinese government needs to take to ensure China's stable recovery after the economic crisis?
Well, it's just as mentioned about the Liang Hui, 2 sessions, Premier Li Keqiang announced the growth target for not lower than 6%. And alongside a set of objectives, including the creation of 11 million new jobs and adoption of a flexible and targeted monetary policy, and many other supportive policies. And China also launched the 4th five-year plan last year, which set up the objective for the next 5 years. One of the objectives is a so-called high-quality economic development. So put all those together, I think there are much more need to be done. First of all, I think it's very important to focus on some the long-term structural problems like the factor market reform. This is something discussed frequently. It's a long objective, but now it's became more important because we face the low productivity as many other, we call it long-term scars from the pandemic. So we need to lift productivity through the reform in land, labor, capital. We call it 6 areas: land, labor, capital, technology, and data. So hopefully the market play a more important role in pricing in those factors, and also increase the efficiency of resources allocation and reduce the distortion existing in the economy. And the second one, I think, consumption, domestic consumption. I think Max mentioned about the lag behind. The growth driver is the consumption. This is very important. The growth engine, which is not only now, but right after the global financial crisis, China actually is on the path to this type of consumption-driven economy. But now it is much more difficult because of the pandemic. The income reduced, and of course, the precautionary savings actually increased. All those together actually reduce consumption is in short period of time. And there are more policy need to be done to boost, confidence to consume, including, it's like continue improve the social security net, and of course increase the dispensable income. This is something very important because it's not only about consumption but also about the income distribution to solve the inequality problem in the country. And the third one, I think, is there is no concept of the dual circulation. Basically, this is it's the same thing. Compared with the past, we call it consumption-driven and openness. So now basically we focus on the external conditions, the change of the environment, and we need to look into more domestic drivers. And there are a lot of discussions how to make those 2 circles interact, and how to try to avoid, we call it isolation or internalization. Something is unwanted of this strategy. And last but not least, I think the openness. Basically, this is still the part of the dual circulation, but openness, I think, is very important for China to be engaged with the world economy. And this is, we call it high-level openness, basically launched last year, and they have new components like more area to be opened and more sectors like service sector to be open. And of course, the rule of law is negatively many items attached to this openness strategy. And this is very important, to keep the Chinese economy going and continue to interact with the world economy. So this is basically some key items. I think there are more, policies attached to exchange rate, the management of the capital flow, because, probably the new tapering environment will pose more challenges and risks, and Chinese government should be alerted of these new risks arising.
Thank you very much.
Julia, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Gao, for this wonderful overview. And since you ended up with all these very, pragmatic notion that there are still some challenges and risks that the Chinese government need to be aware, and something that is in a process like the pandemic that is still developing, I wanted to go back to Max and ask you whether you could tell us, in your opinion, which are the main challenges that actually the China needs to be fully aware in the short and medium run.
Absolutely, but could we just first do a little bit of a sound check here? Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'm also going to try to speak slowly so so that the audience can hear me properly, given that we have some connectivity problems. So I think 2021 is looking to be a pretty strong year for China. There are several factors that contribute to this. First of all, 2020 was a weak base year, so in percentage terms, I think we should expect pretty high growth this year. The IMF agrees with this, and they've forecasted the Chinese economy to grow at around 8%. Another factor that I think will contribute to strong Chinese economic growth this year is that the Americans finally managed to agree on a stimulus program for its own economy, and this will strengthen external demand, which will be beneficial for the Chinese export sector. But I do think that there are some very serious risks to Chinese recovery, and these are very hard to put into a forecasting model. The first one would be a second wave of coronavirus in China. An example of a route this could happen in is the Chinese vaccination program is unrolled to most of the population, and then some sort of mutation shows up and we get a second wave, or simply several outbreaks in many different places and the situation spirals out of control. Whether or not these things will happen is, of course, completely uncertain, but there are possibilities. Number two is the stimulus issues we were already talking about. As I said in my previous segment, the Chinese credit to GDP ratio increased by 35 percentage points in 2020. At the same time, the amount of GDP that is generated for one incremental unit of credit has fallen absolutely tremendously. So now a unit of GDP costs a lot more. At the same time, we have these companies which are close to default. So some sort of refinancing operation may have to be launched at the same time as as policies intended to reduce credit growth have to be put in place. This can slow growth tremendously, and on top of that, it will be if big companies are refinanced, that is indirectly a tax on regular people. So there may be issues with inequality growing as a result to pay off the existing stimulus efforts. And then there is the issue, or there is a potential issue of external demand collapsing. And of course, I just mentioned the American situation, which is positive for China. But in Europe, I think the economic results there's a serious risk of an economic slowdown in Europe, which could potentially reduce the demand for Chinese goods and hurt the Chinese export sector. Now, finally, there is the risk of serious international pushback against China. There are voices raised at various corners of the world which are blaming China for the events surrounding the pandemic. And this may materialize into serious economic pressure.
Well, thank you very much, Max, for again stating so clearly your views on what are the challenges and risks that are not only key to China in the short but also in the medium term. And since we've been discussing on the challenges, the risks, and the response, and what China should do, I wanted to get back to Elisa and ask her, what do you see the role for digital solutions in China's recovery?
The digital solutions for recovery are quite relevant, especially if we focus on one of the points that Max raised, that was the digital sector. I would like to focus on the use of technologies on these areas. As we experience in China, central and local governments, as well as the national authorities, have supported the digital development and distribution of services, both directly and indirectly. It was also the case for the electronic payments. China has a well-built, widely distributed mobile payment system that was very helpful during the crisis. This is, in fact, the risk of also the use of cash. The central bank adopted measures to sanitize and banknotes and coins based on the riskiness of the area of origin. Cash was discouraged, while electronic payments supported also the online shopping in the most developed areas, leveraging the potential of smartphones, consolidated communication infrastructure, and the overall technology. Mobile payments expanded further in and transactions the central bank data. The gaps was registered in most remote and poorest area, pushed toward an extension of the project for a digital currency issued by the central bank. This project is 2013, and it will lead to the issuance of the so-called ECNY. Based on the People China statements, the goal of this project is financial income. It is particularly relevant for the micro and the small for the households. The aim is central bank digital currency guaranteeing its status as a legal tender and non-bank deposit accounts to use digital payments. Based on publicly available information, China's central bank digital currency will be established based on a two-tier system. The first tier will rely on the PBOC, the central bank, that will manage the backup infrastructure, and it will issue the central bank will centralize also the information on all the e-wallets and the transaction. The second tier will rely a scope of selected banks. They will in charge of the distribution of the and they can exploit their broad presence, large size, and the existing infrastructure. Also with the third players in the payment system. Pilot tests have been launched in 5 cities. Another pilot test will be the Beijing Winter Olympics 2022. Further pilots programs will start soon. Given its advanced position in issuing a central bank digital currency, Beijing may export its technologies abroad, especially in the regions where China has more influence and stronger role on trade and investment relations. So the ISPI can play also a relevant role on RMB internationalization, or at least its regionalization. If I'm thinking of the Chinese economic recovery, I can say that a key role has been played by the small and micro companies, which suffered most of the impact of the COVID crisis. To guarantee their viability in medium and long term, it's fundamental as ensure an adequate financial flows. The financial inclusion for small corporates is policymakers concerned at a global level, and as also added by the monetary policy try to sustain services to the micro and the small enterprise through targeted monetary policy decisions. Apart from these policies, apart from the support of the bank, played techs in China, the big techs that are working also in the financial sector. They have helped to tackle the challenges for private companies with structural difficulties to access the traditional credit. The COVID has only amplified challenges and these troubles, especially in the Chinese system, financial system, where risk-averse states tend to focus on big threats while failing to meet the consumer and micro loans. It is the case of it introduced a partnership with traditional banks to strengthen access to money to households and also to small and micro corporates. Most of the beneficiaries were clients with no previous banking, and the clients of this service is a quite huge number. There are more than 500 million users. This business model is also by relying on for issuance loans, for the credit risk assessments, and it is a big economic scale. Fintech in the Chinese economic recovery or financial digitalization played a big
You're breaking up. I don't know if you can hear me, but let's try again maybe to conclude your argument, because you've been breaking up at the end of your talk. I'm sorry.
Okay, so sorry. And so the fintech and the new adapted the financial sector helped also the economic recovery. They played a big role, relevant role. So good. That's it.
Thank you
on my
very
side.
much, Elisa. Thank you very much for your insights, and thank you all the speakers for their insights throughout this roundtable. Alas, a bit unfortunate with regards to our technical parts. We still had received some questions from the audience, and I'll try and direct them to you as they were written. The first one actually comes from one of our colleagues from the Center for Geoeconomics, Davide Tentori, who asks Professor Gao, debt has increased in most countries as a consequence of the ongoing fiscal expansion. Is China's debt sustainable? How important is the limited foreign exposure of Chinese debt in reducing domestic financial vulnerability? Professor Gao, please.
Yeah, this is something we discussed during the panel, and this is very important because the major constraint for physical policy now is the debt accumulation. And now I think that at overall level, it reached to 2080, including corporate, government, and household. And if the external debt is included, it could be a little bit higher, so not that much, because China external debt is reasonably within the range of management. And I think the key issue is, if you look into the debt dynamic, the government debt used to be declining and household debt is rising. And this is some dynamic, and corporate debt is always at very high level. But now the local government debt actually is something far beyond central government. This is something Max discussed. This is a potential default, but it's just very few cases. And I think there could be a much more prudential regulations. I mean, if you read the recent statements from Guo Shuqing, the regulatory body, from the regulatory body, and it's full of awareness of risks. And I think that accumulation basically is a big concern if China wants to put more physical stimulus into the economy. And I think the key issue is we wait for a growth, because this is something, the relative term, we need more growth, GDP growth, and then the debt burden could be a little bit lesser. And also we need more, we call it, there is an input and output. We need to cut the expansion, especially the government side. If you read the Li Keqiang's report, they want to tighten the belt of the government expansion, and also try to broaden the revenue, tax revenue, like postpone retirement age, which is good news for many others, but not only for employees, but also for the government. They could have a much more tax resources. This is my response.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I'm going to briefly follow up with a question for Max. And they ask us, I'm reading it out loud. China has been the main contributor toward GDP growth in 2020 and the only major economy that avoided recession. But how much does China still need the rest of the world to grow at a sustained pace in order to support its own growth? And basically the question asks whether is it time to ripe for domestic demand even more to outpace foreign demand to sustain China's growth, which is basically what's the ultimate aim of the Chinese government.
So in the past years, exports have been enormously helpful for China to reach its growth targets. But if you look at historical data, that has not always been the case. And in the past 20 years or so, generally speaking, consumption growth has outpaced export growth. I think we may be entering an era where China will have to increase its domestic consumption to grow, because I think the propensity to save abroad may be increasing. At the same time, China does seem to have some goals of, for example, establishing an international currency, and these things necessitate more inflow into its own country. So I think we may very well see a situation in the future where China has more consumption, but to some extent, this all hinges on households in China becoming economically stronger. And so far, this is typically not the case. What happens usually is that the corporate sector grows at a slightly faster pace than household income. And I think tackling this issue will be very important for China moving forward.
I see. Thank you very much, Max, for your plain answer. And Elisa, there's also a question for you. We'll try to see whether we can hear you this time. And the question reads: China is the world's second largest digital economy and leads the world in the value of many digital applications, including e-commerce and mobile payments. To what extent will the need for joint international standards to digital trade and technology become pressing after the pandemic? And which are the major challenges for China in this sense?
I think pressure for all the countries to move to digital payments and e-commerce. China was quite ready e-commerce with big players at domestic level, JD, or at the international level at Alibaba. They had a role also on the payment system, and to use this system also as the digital currency at international level, it is fundamental to move to international standards. The point that I would like to raise is if China is the first mover in this sector, also in the digital payments, others can be forced to move after China. And this is the point for the other countries. The standards, it's at international level, and push the others to align, not vice versa. The point is, if China is the first, standards is defined by China, of course, at the beginning.
Well, thank you very much, Elisa. And I'd like to move forward with a question of my own. I don't have a particular speaker in mind, so please feel free to join in. I would like to pick your brains on whether to what extent has the pandemic really spurred green growth in China and Asia alike? Whether we've just had the Lianghui, and there's been a lot of green and environment-related objectives. I wanted your opinion on whether this has really influenced the growth, Chinese growth model, or whether this is just something a process that had already started and that has been increasingly spurred by the crisis. Maybe Professor Gao, you'd like to give some thoughts on this?
Right. So the green recovery is the key word, basically, and it's not only because of the pandemic, but also because China committed to zero, carbon emission. There's a timetable set in the future. So basically, that objective could be translated into a set of policies steps. Basically, I think there are many things already happen, like the green bond, basically initiative by the central bank, and they are quite experience actually in this new area. And also I think the GDP criteria, there's going to be something, the criteria, like performance of the local government could consider the green element. And I think the policies are actually tilt to this green concept currently. And I think there are many things. It's just proposals, and I think this is something it's quite. We need to balance basically, because we need growth, and which actually could be some cost at cost of this the green commitment, but we try to combine them together. I think because this is something, if we really committed to it and make the rule-based commitment, and then something gonna happen. I think this is China is really up to it.
Thank you very much, Professor. Max, would you like to step in on this, on green growth and green growth objectives, perhaps?
Yeah, well, there was certainly quite a lot of statements coming out on this and lofty targets set. I'm quite skeptical, to be honest. China's economy is largely fossil fuel based, as is the most of the world economy, and switching off to even the idea of reaching zero emissions in such a short time seems impossible. Would be my take.
Well, thank you very much. Elisa, would you like to say something about this?
Following the Max point, China burns more coal than the rest of the world economy. President Xi last September stated that his goal is to go to carbon neutrality by 2060, 2030 of the carbon emission. China will invest a lot in green economy and in green finance. And as Italy, we sustain this approach as we presidency of G20 of green economy, green finance, and sustainability. Moreover, the Committee on Sustainable Finance of the G20, co-chaired by the Central Bank of China and the US Treasury, that I believe are the main players for a better and greener environment overall the world.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I do apologize with everyone following us and the speakers for all the technical difficulties that we've been having. I thank you all, and well, before leaving, I just wanted to remind you that the second session with, well, a bit more, hopefully, a bit less technical problems will be held next Tuesday on the 23rd, and will deal with the pandemic's impact on China's international engagement. Thank you for bearing with us. Thank you again to all the speakers for your insightful comments and views. And the chapters of all the speakers and speakers that will be that will participate in the second session will be all collected in an edited volume that will be published in late May. So you will have a chance to read more in detail what our speakers think about China's relaunch. Thank you very much and have a nice day.